Well, what a pleasure it is to be here with you, Lynne, and to have
Vice
the
versa,
opportunity to
Susan.
talk to you about your new book, The Last Hope Island. And I hope many of you have had a chance to look at this book and be sure to get a copy. It's a fantastic read, really. I would put you, Lynne, at the very top of the list of great historical storytellers.
Thank you.
I was a huge fan of your Citizens of London, but this is another absolutely wonderful read, and it's so rich with a long line of people that we haven't really heard that much about. And so I was intrigued by the fact that you got the idea to write this book quite some time ago.
Right.
Why did you decide not to write it then, and why did you decide to write it now?
Well, partly the reason is my own deficiency as a writer. I had the idea after writing a book called Troublesome Young Men, which was my third book in the series of books about England in World War II. And the idea was to write, in doing the research for that book and for previous books, I discovered how the governments of many of the countries that had been occupied in Europe, how the governments and the military forces had fled to England to continue the fight. And you know, we have the image, thanks to Winston Churchill, among others, primary among others, that England stood alone. England stood alone against Hitler until the US and the Soviet Union got into the fight. And that, as I found out, is not entirely true. In fact, it's not true at all, that these governments, these occupied countries, did their own bit to continue the fight, and they were doing it from London, from the base in London. So I thought, well, this would be a wonderful book because it hasn't been written before. Nobody touched this subject, principally, I think, because of the power of Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill, in many ways, defined World War II. You know, he started writing the history of World War II as seen from his perspective shortly after the war, and it came, most of the volumes, the many volumes came out in the early 50s. And his view of the war, his take of the war, had tremendous influence on future historians. And certainly the idea of London, of England standing alone was primary among the myths of the war. So that's why it really hasn't been written about. So I decided, okay, I'm going to do this book. I'm going to do this book of these 7 countries that actually did contribute to the Allied victory in many different ways. It's a great subject, etc. And then so I started doing, and I got a contract from the publisher that had published Troublesome Young Men. So I set off to do the research, and my husband, Stan Cloud, and I went to a number of different countries doing the research. And then it became apparent, 2 things became apparent after about a year of research. One, that they weren't paying me enough to do the kind of research I needed to do. And 2, that I was too inexperienced to handle that big a book. I mean, it was overwhelming, really, for me. I was thinking, how in the hell am I going to organize this? And it's not only 6 countries, it's all this incredible cast of characters. And how do I do it? How do I organize it? And I really didn't know how to do it. So I said to my agent, I can't do it. And then she says, well, what are you going to do instead? And so we proposed a book that became Citizens of London. The publishing company, the publishing house that will remain nameless, said, no, we don't want that. We want the book that you contracted for. So my agent went to Random House. They liked the idea of Citizens of London. I wrote it. It was a big success. I wrote 2 more books that I was very happy with. And then I couldn't come up with an idea, for their successor. And so my agent said, my God, you spent a year doing this research on this idea you had. Why don't you consider writing that book? And I had grown up. I mean, first of all, they were paying me more money than the previous. And second, I realized that I had written 3 more books, and I knew I could do it. I mean, because those 3 books were very similar in ways. They were about England. They were about World War II. So I had enough. I had in my mind a storehouse of knowledge that I did not have before. So I thought, okay, I can take it on. I had all this research that we had done together, and so I just built on it. And it was surprisingly doable. It's amazing how you can learn a lot in succeeding years, and that's the way it happened.
Do you think also the subject perhaps settled into your brain in a certain way? In other words, Citizens of London, you're in a lot of ways the technique is the same. You're looking at human stories that add up to a bigger picture.
Absolutely. And one thing that, as I've said, I have built on, each book has succeeded the other. It's another aspect of war and England to some extent. And so it's kind of like doing a puzzle, a mosaic, and I'm fitting in different pieces of that mosaic as I go along. So it was considerably easier because I did have a lot of that knowledge. And, I really had done so much research on London during the war for Citizens of London that I knew what it was like. So, just expanding it to include these 6, 7 other countries and what they were going through, it was made much easier by that. Yeah.
What a cast of characters in London, really. As I was reading this, having once been a London resident myself, I was thinking, wow, how did that work? Because I'm sure there was some kind of protocol, but just, it's a fabulous, fabulous story. Tell us a little bit about Queen Wilhelmina.
Okay.
She comes across as a great figure,
right?
And of course, she was really quite a figure there in London, wasn't she?
Absolutely. One of the fun things about writing this book is that I got a chance to write about people that are not really that well known, and two of them were monarchs, members of royalty. One was Queen Wilhelmina of the Netherlands, and the other was King Haakon of Norway. They had left their country when they were invaded. Neither one of them wanted to leave their countries. They wanted to stay, but they were persuaded. In fact, they were basically told that they couldn't because obviously they would be under German control. So they both very reluctantly left Holland and Norway. And they thought their countrymen would hate them for what they did, for abandoning them. And initially that was true for both of them. But both of them became kind of the symbols of their country's resistance. Wilhelmina was one of the most extraordinary women that I've ever written about. She had been queen. She had been on the throne of the Netherlands for about 40 years. She was 68, I think, when the war began. She actually became queen when she was 10 years old. She wasn't actually ruler. Her mother was kind of the regent until she became 18. But she had been on the throne since she was 10 and had a very unhappy childhood. She hated being the princess and then the queen because the Dutch court was a very strict, formal court, and she was not allowed to play with any children at all. She was an only child. When she went skating in Amsterdam, the canals were cleared and she had to skate alone. And there's this wonderfully poignant story that she writes in her own memoir, that when she was a little girl and she was playing with her dolls, and if one of the dolls had been naughty, she said to this doll, you better stop being naughty, because if you're not, I'll make you a queen, and then you'll have to play alone. And so she grew up really hating the whole court atmosphere. She wanted to do something. She wanted to perform great deeds like her very famous royal ancestors, King William, all the Dutch kings. But she was a woman, and she was queen. And so she had absolutely no power. Even if she were a man, she still wouldn't have had any power because it was a constitutional monarchy. And so her power was basically she had the right to be consulted, she had the right to warn, but basically her many governments, didn't do that. They didn't take her into consideration at all. She was a woman who was very strong-minded, very, very tough, and she railed against all this. but to no avail until World War II, until her country was invaded. And she went to London. And when she got to London, there was a government in exile, but there was no parliament. So she, in England, in Holland, she was held to account by the government and by parliament. No parliament. She had a much, much bigger role, and she took full advantage of it in two ways, and I'll be very quick about them. One is she went on the BBC to broadcast to her countrymen back home. And the people in Holland were astonished because she was a really remote, aloof queen in Holland. They kind of revered her, but they didn't love her. They didn't even know anything about her. And all of a sudden, they hear this woman attacking Hitler and the Germans in no uncertain terms, and she swore. I mean, this is the queen swearing, in these broadcasts and saying and using amazing words apparently to castigate Hitler, etc. And they were astonished, and they just basically fell in love with her. This queen that they really didn't have any interest in knowing much about. So she kept her country's spirit of resistance alive in her country, but she also kept it alive in London. Her government was basically an appeasing government. They actually wanted, most of her cabinet ministers wanted to negotiate with Hitler and basically give in. And Wilhemina said, not on my watch, you're not going to do that. And the prime minister threatened to resign, and she immediately accepted it. And then she appointed the only member of the cabinet that she thought would really hold out, who would really fight and keep Holland in the war. And so she appointed him prime minister. And she did this single-handedly. She could never have gotten away with it after the war. This is her one time in power, and she took full advantage of it. I could go on, but there are others we need to talk about. But she was probably by far my favorite character in the book. Yeah.
Well, it's a remarkable story, and of course she's legendary now in the Netherlands, isn't she?
Oh, she is. She is. At the end of the war, I think she's probably the most loved modern monarch that Holland has had, and I think as a result of the way she handled herself in the war, the monarchy is still terribly popular in Holland, and it really wasn't before. The same thing is true in Norway. The reaction of King Haakon, who stood up to the Germans when Hitler invaded Norway and ordered Haakon to give in. Haakon left Oslo with the royal family and his government, and he was pursued by German troops who were trying to kill him. He and his government fled in cars and up to northern Norway, being followed by not only troops but German airplanes trying to kill him. He got out and went to England, and he again went on the BBC and became the soul of Norway's resistance. In fact, Norway's resistance movement emblem or symbol was H7, meaning Haakon the Seventh, and he became the most loved sovereign of Norway. He lived for another 20 years after the war, and the Norwegian monarchy is still lived there too.
It's a remarkable story. You've mentioned the BBC twice.
Yeah.
And it turned out to be a very, very powerful weapon,
Yeah.
wasn't it, for the resistance and for those in London? Say a little more about that. We've kind of dismantled our U.S. capability in this area. Voice of America and other things are, a shadow of, if they even exist at all. I think we've still got Radio Free Europe in some places, but not like the role the BBC played during the war.
The BBC, when the war began, was not really broadcasting internationally. It had just started. Remember, radio was still really new when the war began in 1939. Radio had only come into its glory in the early 1930s, late 1920s. And the BBC was very provincial. It was very English. It was very I don't know if any of you have seen the movie The King's Speech, when the king goes in to broadcast and he's met by a guy in a tux, and that was a BBC announcer. BBC announcers had to wear formal evening clothes to announce because it was very formal and it was very upper class and with Oxbridge accents. They all had Oxbridge accents. It wasn't a people's network. And it wasn't it wasn't a global network at all. And then the war came along and it changed like that. The BBC started reporting, broadcasting to most of occupied Europe, as well as many other countries in the world, and to occupied Europe, to people in France and Norway and Poland. It was the voice of freedom. Millions of people listened to the BBC internationally, risking their lives. The Germans had outlawed listening to international radio, especially the BBC. But everywhere, in Norway, in Poland, people would take out their radios. They had hid them, under, behind walls, and they would take them out when their country's broadcasts would come on, usually during the evening. And they'd turn them on and they'd hear the bells of Big Ben, and then they'd listen for "This is London calling." And so they would find out what was going on with the war. And it changed dramatically the climate in many of these countries. I mean, just think about it. The Germans had just mowed down all these countries, within a couple of weeks. And they kept saying to the people of Europe, it's over. You're helpless. We have won. And those countries believed it. People in those countries believed it until it became clear Britain was still holding out. And thanks to British radio, BBC, they learned that, in fact, the war was not over, and that, in fact, as the war went on, they themselves could do something to make sure that the Germans were defeated. And so the BBC was incredibly important for the growth of resistance movements in all these countries, particularly in France. They not only broadcast these wonderful programs about what was going on, they also sent coded messages to resistance movements in France and other places. A personal message like "John loves Mary," which was a coded message to a particular resistance network that perhaps the RAF was bringing in, weapons for that particular network. So they were extraordinarily important to the Allied victory. And at the end of the war, this very insular network, really aimed mostly at the Brits, had become the world's most trusted method of communication. I mean, the change in the BBC was extraordinary, and they remained that way, and to some degree they still are. But it was all thanks to World War II.
Well, one of the great figures of these BBC broadcasts, I was really charmed to see him in your book, was Jan Masaryk.
Yes,
He was the son of the first president of Czechoslovakia after World War I,
right,
when Czechoslovakia became a sovereign country. And he was a real raconteur, wasn't he?
Yes, he was.
Yes, and I actually wrote a long paper on Jan Masaryk at one stage because he has a very interesting ending to his life. One of the great mysteries of the Cold War, whether he was assassinated or whether he committed suicide during the communist coup in 1948 in Czechoslovakia. But say a little bit more about Jan Masaryk and the other, those who were in Eastern Europe and the rest of it, because this was even these were even points even farther away, Poland and the rest of it.
Mm-hmm. Eastern Europe got the short shaft, as most of you know, at the end of the war, but they played an incredibly important role. I was talking about how these countries actually did contribute a lot, and I'll talk about Jan Masaryk in a minute, but the Poles particularly. Let me just tell you very quickly some of the things that the Poles did. In the Battle of Britain, the Battle of Britain, well, at least Stan and I, when we started writing about this, thought in the Battle of Britain that most of the RAF pilots were British. I mean, that's what you'd think, or maybe all of them were British. In fact, 20% of the pilots who flew in the Battle of Britain were from occupied Europe. And most of them were Poles and Czechs. But the Poles were particularly good, and in fact were credited by the British for making the difference in the victory in the Battle of Britain, something that most people don't know. The second thing is Enigma. All of you, I think, probably know about the Enigma Machine and cracking the Enigma code. And if you've seen the movie Imitation Game, you think that Alan Turing and Bletchley Park were totally responsible for that. In fact, it was Polish code breakers who first broke the Enigma code. And they gave copies of the Enigma Machine to the French and to the English right before World War II began, along with instructions on how to use it. So yes, Bletchley Park was very, very important in overall in cracking all of the Enigma codes, but they couldn't have done it without the Poles initially. So the list goes on and on of the contributions that Eastern Europeans made. Jan Masaryk was the foreign minister of the Czech government in exile, extremely important. And he also broadcast to Czechoslovakia. He broadcast to Czechoslovakia. He was their favorite broadcaster over the BBC. And in the end, both Poland and Czechoslovakia were betrayed by the Allies. And in different ways, Poland was immediately taken over by the Soviet Union at the end of the war. It took 3 more years before the Czechs also fell under Soviet control. But it was a very sad ending for 2 extremely loyal allies who contributed a great deal, as I said, to the victory.
Well, there are so many other examples, too, in the book that really speak of extraordinary bravery. I was rather overwhelmed by these young girls who signed up to be pilots with a 6 weeks life expectancy?
I don't write about women.
Well, okay. So, but no, maybe you could just talk about acts of bravery, things that really stood out for you.
Well, certainly.
No, I mean you were. This wasn't about writing about women.
Yeah.
It was just an example.
Oh yeah,
of some,
absolutely.
Special operations people.
I do write a lot about women in terms of the resistance in the various countries. The resistance movements did play a big role in the Allied victory, particularly a strand of resistance that we don't hear about. I think mostly when you think about the resistance, according to books and novels and movies, it's sabotage. You know, it's the active resistance. It's blowing up bridges. It's that kind of thing, or escape networks, where people in these countries would help Allied airmen who had been shot down, for example, to get out and to get to Spain and then back to England. Both very important. But the really important strand of resistance were the intelligence networks. Again, particularly in France. These were spy networks that were set up by people within the country itself, and they would report on German military presence in whatever country they were, and they would send that information at the risk of their lives back to England, to the MI6 British intelligence or to American intelligence. And all of this intelligence was gathered together and was important in so many ways, but one of them was D-Day. In France, you had dozens of small networks collecting information about the D-Day, the Normandy beaches, and what kind of defense fortifications the Allied troops would face when they finally arrived. And they were hugely important to the success of D-Day. But what really was interesting to me was how many of these resistance workers were women. Women were really the lifeblood of resistance in many countries, including in France. And they ran the escape networks. My new book, which is coming out in March, is about the only woman who headed a major intelligence network in France. and they have never really gotten the credit they deserve. But overall, men and women played hugely important roles, and you know, they were risking their lives every day.
Sure.
Thousands of them were captured and executed by the Gestapo, but they kept going because they desperately wanted to rid their countries of the Germans, and they wanted to get freedom back. And as I said before, I don't think they really, when you think about the war, they really don't get the credit that they deserve.
So you had a favorite with Queen Wilhelmina, but who would you say was the most powerful person in exile? Would that have been Charles de Gaulle?
Oh, it was certainly the one who dominated was Charles de Gaulle. Charles de Gaulle, he was an anomaly. You know, I talk about 6 countries. There were 6 legal governments who left their countries and set up shop in London, and they were regarded as the legal governments of their country. They were treated that way by Britain and the United States. The one outlier is Charles de Gaulle, because the legal government of France stayed in France. That was the Vichy government. It was the legal government of France. And Charles de Gaulle was this relatively unknown brigadier general, you know, a very junior, general officer, who had this very lowly job in the French government, and he was the only one, the only official from France who went to England and said, we must resist. And so you can imagine, I mean, so he had a problem in that regard. He was considered a traitor, and he was also personally, he was impossible to get along with. I mean, nobody got along with him, including the people who were most devoted to him on his staff. He was glacial. His family said he fell into a freezer when he was young and never really recovered. He was just terribly difficult to get along with. And yet, this guy who had nothing, as he said, when he got to London, he had absolutely nothing. He had nobody, or very few people following him. He was impossible to get along with. He was considered a traitor. And yet, over the course of 5 years, he managed to make people think that he was the leader of the French. And he was. He became, even to the great dismay of Winston Churchill and especially Franklin Roosevelt. Roosevelt tried everything he could to destroy him politically. Churchill had a love-hate relationship with him. He admired him, but he also hated him because he was so difficult. Yet that strength of character and personality and that total bullheadedness helped de Gaulle, as I said, become the leader. He was the leader of France at the end of the war, and France was considered, you know, not a great power, but it's still, thanks to de Gaulle and his people, was considered a power still. So his story is just amazing that he was able to do all this, you know, being hated by so many people, and yet he pulled it through. I must say also that the reason he was accepted as a leader is because the resistance in France accepted him as the leader. If he hadn't been the spokesman for the resistance in France, he would never have made it. But the French resistance united enough. They were very fractious, but they united enough to accept de Gaulle, and as a result, he ended up very well.
Well, the remarkable thing is not only does he go from relative obscurity to being the head of France after the war, but he really finally comes and saves France itself in the late 1950s.
Yeah.
I mean,
actually, one of the stories that I really love about de Gaulle is his relationship with your grandfather. Yeah. Dwight Eisenhower, being over there, understood how important de Gaulle was, and he was ordered time and time again by Roosevelt to kind of try to derail de Gaulle, and Eisenhower knew that was impossible, and so he quietly kind of went around Roosevelt and basically accepted him. He knew that de Gaulle was going to be the leader, and that there was no way that America, that it would be a disaster, a total disaster, if America tried to destroy him or stop him. And so I think your grandfather had a lot to do with
including allowing him to liberate Paris.
Exactly.
Be seen to be liberating Paris, right?
Exactly, yeah.
Well, I hope this isn't an unwanted interjection here, but I remember him coming to my grandfather's funeral, and by this time he has already been president of France. And you know, he came to that funeral in 1969 in his French military uniform.
Did he really?
From the war.
Oh, my goodness.
Oh, it still gives me chills up and down my spine. Well, you know, the thing is that books are like children. You know, you love them all and the rest of it. Tell us, and then maybe we'll have some time to open up some questions from the audience, but tell us, just sort of in concluding this discussion with you, what did this book mean to you?
It meant a lot to me. It meant a lot that I could finally actually write it. That was important. But it meant a lot just in terms of perception of the war, and that how important alliances were. Alliances that still have not really been recognized now. How important that Britain and Churchill accepted these countries and allowed them to come in and continue the fight. It was important both for those countries, and it was important for Britain. One of the things that I write about in this book that, again, has not been reported on is that experience was really the seedbed of the European Union. These leaders of these European countries were forced to work together and socialize together for 5 years. And that would never have happened, you know, if the war hadn't come along. And as a result of that, they decided, they knew that they had to continue working together. They had to cooperate with each other. If this kind of catastrophe, if they wanted to avoid this kind of catastrophe from happening again. So basically, those 5 years was the seedbed of the European Union. After the war was over, in fact, during the war, they started meeting together and coming up with ideas of alliances to integrate Europe. And that continued on after the war. And it happened. I mean, they put together the forerunner of the European Union. And whatever you think of the European Union now, the fight, the drive to integrate Europe helped create more than 50 years of prosperity and security in Western Europe. It would not have happened, I don't think, without the European Union and the other international alliances that we have, NATO, etc. So this was all extremely important, and I fear that Susan and I were talking about, I fear we're losing that. I mean, as World War II, you know, goes further and further in the past, most people who were alive in World War II, or I mean, who were adults or fought in World War II, are gone. Our memory is fading, and the memory is fading about how important it is to band together and to work together to prevent this kind of thing from ever happening again. It did happen, and it can happen again. I mean, we can keep it together, but we have to work together to do it.
We sure do. We've got a question back here.
Yes,
sir. Maybe you could stand up just so that we're sure that everybody can hear you. Thank you.
Given your background in England and the remarks you just made, what's your personal view on Brexit?
Okay, did everybody hear that?
What's my personal view on Brexit, given my background in writing about England? I think it's a total disaster. I mean, I've thought that from the beginning. Again, it's historical amnesia. But you have to remember, the Brits have always been an insular country. This 5 years was kind of an anomaly. The Europeans really hoped the Brits would take the lead in creating a united Europe. After all, they had provided a refuge for the rest of Europe when the going got tough, but the Brits reverted to their insular traditions. They still, after the war, thought of themselves as still a great power, even though it was clear their days as a great power were over. Had the idea of standing alone, that they stood alone, which of course they didn't. And so they basically, right from the beginning, didn't really want to be part of this alliance. It's really sad. I mean, Brexit is really, really, really sad. And I fear that if something isn't done, if there's a hard Brexit, it's going to be really tough for not just England, but for Europe and really for the rest of the world.
And for the rest of the world.
You agree?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, I do. I couldn't understand it. I was living in Britain when they went to decimalization, and they were sure there was a giant conspiracy underway that everybody was going to be robbed of money because they changed the currency.
Right.
So you're right about there being the slight outlier back there. Yes, sir. Oh. Could you, forgive me, but could you stand so that we're sure that everybody can hear the question? Thank you.
No. Roosevelt took an adamant dislike to de Gaulle without ever having, before he met him. I mean, he was so upset that the French capitulated that he just wrote them off totally. He had no concept of the divisions in that country and how difficult it had been. And so he just basically said France does not exist and it won't exist until after the war. Well, that was crazy. I mean, France did exist, not in a good way. I mean, they were having a lot of problems, but they needed to be helped during the war. I am such a total fan of Susan's grandfather. I think in so many ways he was certainly a seminal figure in that alliance, the Anglo-American alliance. Without Eisenhower, I don't know if the military alliance would have continued to exist. But I don't know. What do you think?
Well, no, it's. I guess the interesting part about this is that every time Roosevelt was confronted with a problem related to de Gaulle, he'd make Eisenhower sort the problem out. And so actually, I think Dwight Eisenhower actually developed over time real respect for him.
Well, de Gaulle had similar respect for your grandfather.
That's right. In 1959, during the U-2 crisis, de Gaulle stands right beside the United States and tells Nikita Khrushchev to shut up and sit down. It was...
And just one further note to add on that, I think what Roosevelt did really hurt the French-American alliance, and it has ramifications today.
Yeah.
I really do. I really do. I mean, he was so furious, de Gaulle was, and the French were, about how they were treated, not only by Roosevelt, but Churchill, but particularly Roosevelt, that there was real antagonism that I think still reverberates.
Yes.
Right now.
Did Truman accept de Gaulle? Because Truman took over before the war was really over.
Yeah, I don't really know.
don't know.
Did Truman accept de Gaulle? He certainly didn't have there wasn't this visceral dislike, and France had already been brought back into the kind of the community of fairly great powers in France. So I think it certainly was a better relationship.
Well, and the only thing I would add to that is a lot of people, Charles de Gaulle is such a towering figure for France that many people forget that after the war he went into retirement.
That's right. He
was
for
sort of
that's
off
right,
the
you're
scene until
absolutely right.
1959 when he comes back really to save France from
That's right.
further disintegration.
He resigned in 1947, I think.
Something like that, yeah.
And then didn't come back until 1958.
Right. We have any other questions here?
Yes.
There.
Maybe you can answer, you can. I read a couple books that the appeasement by Chamberlain really wasn't as dumb as history has made it out to be. And the theory that England was so weak that if they had gone to war then, they would have lost right there and then. Is there any truth to that?
Well, I've heard that. I mean, I've read that.
Would you like to repeat the
yeah,
question?
I'm sorry.
In case anybody...
The question was that there have been a couple of books that Chamberlain should not be as condemned as he was, that for appeasement, that Britain would have lost the war at that point. I would argue that Chamberlain that Chamberlain could have done a lot more to prepare Britain for war, as could have his predecessor, Stanley Baldwin. But they were preparing the country for defending a war. The only military branch that was fairly strong at the beginning of the war was the Air Force. But it was for defensive warfare. In other words, there were very few bombers, but there were a lot of fighter planes. That's the only area in which they were strong. They were not prepared right from the beginning of starting in the mid 30s, early 30s. There was no thought of challenging Hitler at all, and so the argument has been made, but I don't agree with it.
Well, Lynn, first of all, this has been absolutely fascinating, and this is a terrific book. It really is, in the great Lynn Olson style. We've got just a few more minutes. Would you like to sort of wrap it up and leave us with a thought about all of this? Looking back here, we're coming into we're right now in the 75th anniversary of all these events anyway, but right. We're going to be coming into Victory in Europe Day.
Yeah. The only thought I would say is we've been talking about the great people, the leaders, the kings, the queens, the prime ministers, the generals, but the role that ordinary people played in the war, and in the case of this book, I'm really not writing about soldiers, I'm writing about people in the countries who stood up to be counted. When their country's future was at stake, these people were not professional soldiers. When I talk about, for example, the resistance movements or these intelligence networks, they weren't professional spies. They were doctors, they were fishermen, they were blacksmiths, they were truck drivers who, were risking their lives, as I said. They could have just stayed quiet and hopefully have gotten through the war. But hundreds of thousands all over Europe basically said, I will not stand for this. I want to save the soul and honor of my country. And that's what I really took away from writing this book. It was these great characters, de Gaulle, etc., that were really interesting. But even more interesting to me were these 20-year-old girls who escorted, British and American pilots who didn't look like Europeans at all. They were tall and red-haired, and they were chewing gum. They escorted them hundreds of miles across Belgium and the Netherlands and France to neutral Spain, risking their lives. They were on trains and they were on buses with these guys who no way looked like Europeans to get them to safety. To the people who were spies, to the people who were setting off explosives on trains to stop the Germans. These are the people, in many ways, that were the true heroes, I think.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more. What an absolutely fantastic book, and I hope you all have a chance to read it, because I think there's so many lessons for us right now, right? We tend to feel powerless,
right?
When we're in a state of anxiety and concern about not just our own country, but the international situation. But it's really inspiring.
Each and every one of you and each and every one of us has the power to do something. And I think we count for something. We do count for something. Each of us counts for something. And on that note, thank you very much.
Thank you.